The sound of thunder split the evening sky, but it wasn't a storm that had Preston Nash pressing his heels into his stallion's flanks as he rode hard toward the commotion near Miller's Creek. It was the terrified screams of horses and the unmistakable crack of lightning striking too close to earth. Years of living alone in the mountains had made him sensitive to the sounds of distress, whether animal or human, and something about this particular chaos pulled at him with an urgency he couldn't ignore. Preston had come down from his cabin in the pine-covered peaks overlooking St. George, Utah Territory, 3 days prior with a load of furs to trade and supplies to purchase. It was late summer in 1878, and the desert valley was still holding on to the heat of the day even as the sun began its descent behind the red rock cliffs that gave this territory its distinctive beauty. He'd planned to stay in town only long enough to conduct his business and maybe share a drink or two at the saloon before heading back to his solitary existence. But fate had other plans. As he rounded the bend in the trail, Preston's gray eyes took in the scene before him. A small wagon train, no more than 4 covered wagons, had pulled off to make camp near the creek. The lightning must have spooked the horses because several were rearing and pulling at their tethers while others had broken free and were running in panicked circles. Men were shouting and running after the animals, their voices adding to the chaos rather than calming it. But cutting through all that noise was something else entirely. A woman's voice, clear and pure as the mountain streams Preston knew so well, was singing. Not shouting, not calling out in panic, but singing a melody that seemed to wrap around the frightened animals like a gentle hand. Preston pulled his stallion to a stop and sat there, transfixed, as he watched a young woman in a dusty blue calico dress move slowly among the horses. Her long chestnut hair had come partially loose from its pins and hung in waves down her back as she approached a particularly agitated mare. The woman's voice never wavered, never broke, as she sang what sounded like an old hymn, though Preston couldn't quite make out the words from this distance. What struck him most was the effect it was having. The mare's ears, which had been pinned back in fear, began to swivel forward. The wild rolling of her eyes started to calm. The woman extended her hand slowly, still singing, and the horse actually took a step toward her instead of away. Preston found himself dismounting without conscious thought, his own restless spirit drawn to that voice like a moth to flame. For 5 years, since the war had ended and he'd lost everything that mattered, he'd lived in isolation. The nightmares that plagued his sleep, the memories of battles and blood that wouldn't fade, the knowledge that he'd survived when so many good men hadn't, all of it had driven him away from civilization. The mountains had been his refuge, the silence his companion. But this woman's voice was reaching into places inside him that he'd thought were dead and frozen. He walked closer, leading his stallion, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle the horses again. The woman had managed to catch hold of the mare's halter and was stroking the animal's neck, still singing softly. Her voice had changed now to a different tune, something that sounded like a lullaby. One by one, the other loose horses began to settle, drawn by the soothing sound. The men from the wagon train had stopped their frantic chasing and were standing back, watching in amazement as this slip of a woman accomplished what all their shouting and rope waving had failed to do. Preston recognized the wisdom in their restraint, even if it had taken them a while to figure it out. As the woman turned to lead the mare back toward the wagon circle, she finally noticed Preston standing there. Their eyes met across the dusty ground, and he felt something shift in his chest, like a key turning in a long, locked door. Her eyes were green, he realized, the color of new leaves in spring, and they were studying him with equal curiosity. She didn't look afraid of him, despite his rough appearance. Preston knew he must look intimidating, standing well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and arms thick with muscle from years of hard living in the wilderness. His dark hair hung past his collar, and several days of beard growth shadowed his jaw. But she just looked at him steadily, still humming softly to keep the mare calm. "You've got a way with horses," Preston said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. He wasn't used to talking to people anymore, and especially not to beautiful young women who sang like angels. "They just need to know someone understands their fear," she replied, her speaking voice as pleasant as her singing had been. "Running and shouting only makes them more frightened." One of the men from the wagon train hurried over, an older fellow with gray in his beard and worry in his eyes. "Miss Lily, you shouldn't have put yourself at risk like that if one of those horses had kicked you." "But they didn't, Mr. Thornton," the woman, Lily, said gently. "They never do." Preston filed away the name in his mind. Lily. It suited her somehow, this woman who could bring calm to chaos with nothing but her voice. He noticed she wore no wedding ring, though that didn't necessarily mean anything out here where jewelry was often impractical or unaffordable. "Where are you folks headed?" Preston asked, addressing Mr. Thornton but unable to stop his eyes from drifting back to Lily. "We're bound for a settlement about 40 miles north of here," Thornton explained. "Small farming community that's looking for families to help build it up. I'm taking my daughter and her husband, plus the Richardsons here, and Miss Lily Rose, who's going to teach school once they get one built." Lily Rose. Even her last name sounded like it belonged in a song. Preston found himself searching for a reason to extend this conversation, this unexpected connection to another human being that didn't make him want to retreat back into solitude. "Storm's not finished yet," he said, glancing at the sky where dark clouds were still rolling across the desert. "You can see more lightning to the west. You'll want to get those horses settled properly and maybe post someone to keep watch. Animals can sense storms before they hit. Are you offering to help, stranger?" This came from a younger man who'd walked up to join them, his arm around a pregnant woman who must be Thornton's daughter. There was a slight edge to his voice that Preston recognized as protective suspicion. "I'm offering advice," Preston replied evenly, "but I'll help if you want it." "Name's Preston Nash. I've got a cabin up in the mountains, but I know this territory well." Thornton looked relieved. "We'd be grateful for the help, Mr. Nash. The truth is, none of us have much experience with desert storms, and this trip has been harder than we expected." "I'm William Thornton. This is my daughter Sarah and her husband James Crawford, and the couple over there." He gestured to a middle-aged pair watching from beside one of the wagons, "are Henry and Martha Richardson." Preston nodded to each of them in turn, but his attention kept returning to Lily Rose. She had finished securing the mare and was moving to help gather the other loose horses, still humming under her breath. He found himself following her, his own knowledge of horses making him a natural partner in the task. "How long have you been using singing to calm them?" he asked as they worked together to guide a nervous gelding back toward the wagons. "Since I was a little girl," Lily said. "My father had a farm in Ohio, and I used to sing to the animals when they got frightened. He always said I had my mother's voice. She died when I was 6, but people said she could sing so beautifully that birds would stop to listen." "They were right about the voice," Preston said, then felt heat rise in his face at his own forwardness. "I mean, it's clear you inherited her gift." Lily smiled at him, and Preston felt that locked door in his chest crack open a little wider. "Thank you, Mr. Nash. That's kind of you to say." They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, getting all the horses secured and ensuring they were calm before another storm cell could roll through. Preston found himself acutely aware of Lily's presence beside him. The way she moved with quiet confidence, the way her voice never quite stopped its soothing sounds even when she wasn't actively singing. There was something about her that felt like peace itself, and his war-torn soul was drinking it in like a man dying of thirst. As they finished with the last horse, Lily turned to him with curiosity in those green eyes. "You said you live in the mountains. That must be a solitary life." "It is," Preston acknowledged. "I prefer it that way. Too many people, too much noise. It doesn't sit well with me." He saw understanding flicker across her face and something else too, compassion maybe or recognition. "But you came down to help us anyway." "I heard the commotion," he said, not willing to admit even to himself how powerfully her voice had drawn him. Seemed like the right thing to do. The storm did indeed return that night, rolling through with impressive displays of lightning and booming thunder that echoed off the red rock formations surrounding the valley. Preston had accepted Thornton's invitation to share their camp rather than ride back to town in the dark with a storm approaching, though he'd insisted on keeping his own bedroll apart from the main group, out of long habit. He lay awake listening to the rain drum against the canvas of the covered wagons and watching the lightning illuminate the desert in brief, brilliant flashes. Sleep had become a complicated thing for Preston since the war. Some nights it came easily enough, especially when he was exhausted from a day of hard work in the mountains. Other nights, the memories came rushing back, and he'd spend the dark hours fighting battles that were long over with enemies who were either dead or moved on with their lives. Tonight, his mind wasn't on the war. It was on a woman with chestnut hair and a voice that had somehow reached past all his carefully constructed walls and touched something he'd thought was dead. He'd been alone for so long, had convinced himself that isolation was not just necessary but preferred, that the restlessness that drove him was simply part of who he'd become. But listening to Lily sing to those horses had awakened something in him, a longing for connection that he'd buried deep. The rain began to ease around midnight and Preston finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, and lay there for a moment listening to the sounds of the camp. Someone was already up and moving around, and he could smell coffee brewing. His stomach reminded him that he'd eaten only jerky and hardtack yesterday, too focused on the encounter with the wagon train to bother with a proper meal. When Preston emerged from his bedroll and made his way toward the fire, he found Lily there, tending the flames and watching over a pot of coffee. She looked up as he approached, and he was struck again by how her presence seemed to calm something inside him. "I hope I didn't wake you," she said softly. "I'm an early riser, and I thought everyone might appreciate coffee when they got up." "I'm always up early," Preston said, accepting the cup she poured for him. Their fingers brushed as she handed it over, and he felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the hot liquid. Force of habit. Lily settled back on the log she'd been using as a seat, cradling her own cup between her hands. "Mr. Thornton told me you fought in the war." "That must have been difficult." Preston stiffened slightly, his natural instinct to deflect any discussion of that part of his life. But something about the way Lily had said it, without pity or judgment, just simple acknowledgement, made him willing to respond rather than shut down. "It was," he said simply. "Lost a lot of good men, lost parts of myself too, I suppose." "Is that why you live alone in the mountains?" "Seemed easier than trying to fit back into the world that kept going while we were off fighting," Preston admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "Up there, things make sense. Work hard, survive, repeat. No complicated feelings, no expectations I can't meet." Lily was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee and watching the last stars fade from the sky as dawn approached. "I understand wanting simplicity," she finally said. "After my father died 2 years ago, I had to figure out who I was without him. He'd been the center of my world for so long. Teaching seemed like something I could do that was straightforward. Help children learn to read and write, give them skills for their future. But I've learned that running from complicated feelings doesn't make them go away. They just wait for you." Preston found himself studying her profile in the growing light. There was a strength in her that went beyond her ability to calm frightened horses. She'd lost her mother young and then her father, yet here she was, heading toward an uncertain future in an unsettled territory, planning to teach children who might or might not ever have a proper schoolhouse. That took courage. "You're not afraid?" he asked. "Going to a new settlement where everything's still being built?" "Of course I'm afraid," Lily said with a small smile. "But I've found that doing things afraid is sometimes the only way to do them at all. And Mr. Thornton assured me the settlement has good people who truly want a school for their children. That's worth being afraid for." The others began to wake and emerge from the wagons, and the moment of quiet intimacy between Preston and Lily ended. But he found himself reluctant to leave, making excuses to linger as the wagon train prepared to continue their journey. He helped them check the wheels and axles, examined the horses' hooves, offered advice about the terrain they'd be crossing. Thornton noticed, of course. The older man had sharp eyes and a knowing smile that suggested he understood exactly what was keeping Preston from mounting his stallion and riding away. When the wagons were finally ready to depart, Thornton approached Preston with a proposition. "We could use someone who knows this territory," Thornton said. "I'll admit we're more prepared for farming than navigating desert trails. If you were willing to guide us to the settlement, I'd make it worth your while." Preston should have said no. He had furs to trade back in St. George, supplies to purchase, and a life of comfortable isolation waiting for him in the mountains. But his eyes drifted to where Lily was helping Sarah Crawford climb back into her wagon, and he heard himself saying, "I'll do it. No payment necessary. Consider it neighborly assistance." Thornton's knowing smile grew wider, but he just clapped Preston on the shoulder. "We're grateful, Mr. Nash. Truly." The journey to the settlement took 3 days, and Preston found himself fighting a losing battle against the feelings growing in his chest. Every evening when they made camp, Lily would sing as the sun set, her voice carrying across the desert landscape and making even the harsh terrain seem beautiful. Preston would sit at the edge of the firelight, ostensibly keeping watch, but really just listening to her and feeling his restless spirit settle in ways he hadn't thought possible. During the days, as the wagons rolled slowly north through the desert, Preston rode alongside, sometimes scouting ahead for the best route, sometimes dropping back to check on the rear wagon. But he found his horse gravitating toward wherever Lily was. She often walked beside the wagons rather than riding in them, saying the movement helped her think, and Preston would dismount and walk with her, leading his stallion and talking about everything and nothing. Lily told him about her childhood in Ohio, about learning to read from her father, who'd valued education above almost everything else. She told him about the students she'd taught at a small school near Cincinnati before deciding to come west, about her dreams of helping children discover the joy of learning. She spoke with such passion about teaching that Preston couldn't help but smile, his usually serious face transforming in ways that made Lily catch her breath. In turn, Preston found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone. About growing up in Missouri, about the farm his family had owned before the war tore everything apart, about his younger brother who died at Shiloh, and the guilt that still gnawed at him for surviving when so many hadn't. About the peace he'd found in the mountains, but also the loneliness he'd never quite acknowledged until now. "You know," Lily said on the second afternoon as they walked together, "singing to the horses isn't really about the horses. I mean, it is, but it's also about me. When I sing, I feel connected to something bigger than my fears or my grief. It reminds me that there's beauty in the world worth preserving." Preston understood exactly what she meant. Just listening to her had been doing something similar for him, reminding him that there were things beyond survival worth living for. "Your voice," he said, then paused, searching for the right words. "When I heard you singing to those horses that first day, it was like something I didn't even know was frozen inside me started to thaw." Lily stopped walking and turned to face him fully. They were far enough from the wagons to have privacy, standing in the shade of a tall red rock formation that had forced the trail to curve. Her green eyes searched his face, and Preston felt completely exposed in a way that should have terrified him but somehow didn't. "You carry a lot of pain," she said softly. "I can see it in your eyes, but I also see strength and goodness. You don't give yourself enough credit for who you are now, Preston. You keep defining yourself by what you lost instead of what you've survived." No one had spoken to him with such direct honesty in years. Most people either avoided discussing anything personal with him, or they offered meaningless platitudes about the war being over and him needing to move on. But Lily simply saw him, all of him, and wasn't afraid of what she saw. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I am," Preston admitted. "A man who lives alone in the mountains and tries not to think too much about anything beyond the next day." "Maybe you don't have to know right now," Lily said. "Maybe it's enough to just be open to the possibility that you could be more, could have more, if you wanted it." She reached out and touched his arm, just a brief contact, but Preston felt it like lightning. Not the dangerous kind that had spooked the horses, but the kind that illuminated everything, showing him a future he hadn't let himself imagine. "Lily, he started, but voices calling from up ahead interrupted them. The wagons had stopped for some reason, and Thornton was waving for Preston to come look at something. The moment passed, but Preston carried it with him as they rejoined the group. There was a washout across the trail ahead, damage from the recent storm that made the usual route impassable for the heavy wagons. Preston rode ahead to scout an alternative, grateful for something practical to focus on while his emotions churned. He found a way around that added only about 2 miles to their journey, but it meant they'd have to camp one more night before reaching the settlement. When Preston returned to report this, he caught sight of Lily's face and saw something that might have been relief. Maybe she wasn't ready for their time together to end either. That third night, after everyone else had retired to their bedrolls, Preston and Lily sat by the dying fire together. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any clouds, and the desert air had cooled to a pleasant temperature. Lily had been singing earlier, a haunting melody about longing and homecoming, and her voice still seemed to echo in Preston's mind. "Can I ask you something?" Lily said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Anything," Preston replied and meant it. "What are you afraid of?" "I mean, really afraid of deep down." Preston took a long breath, considering his answer. With anyone else, he might have deflected or given a surface-level response. But Lily deserved his honesty. "I'm afraid that if I let myself want something, need something, it'll be taken away just like everything else was," he said. "I'm afraid that the man I am now, this scarred and damaged version, isn't capable of being what someone else might need. And I'm afraid that the restlessness inside me, the thing that drove me to the mountains in the first place, will always be there no matter what I do." Lily was quiet for a moment, and then she began to hum. It was the same melody she'd used on that first day with the horses, soothing and gentle. Preston felt his shoulders, which had tensed as he spoke, gradually relax. "You feel restless right now?" she asked. Preston considered the question honestly. For the past 3 days, walking beside her, talking with her, simply being in her presence, the constant agitation that had plagued him for years had been remarkably quiet. "No," he admitted. "I don't." "Maybe your spirit wasn't restless because it wanted to be," Lily suggested. "Maybe it was restless because it was searching for something, or someone." The implications of her words hung in the air between them. Preston looked at her in the firelight, at the way the flames painted gold highlights in her chestnut hair, at the gentle curve of her face and the hope in her eyes. He'd known her for 3 days. It was ridiculous to feel what he was feeling, wasn't it? People didn't fall in love in 3 days. Except soldiers did sometimes, knowing that time might be short. And maybe people on the frontier did too, where life was uncertain and chances had to be taken when they appeared. "Lily Rose," Preston said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm a man who doesn't have much to offer. I live in a cabin in the mountains with no neighbors for miles. I wake up with nightmares sometimes. I've spent so long alone that I'm not even sure I remember how to be with people properly. But these past 3 days with you have been the best I've had in longer than I can remember. If there's any chance you might consider." He trailed off, suddenly unsure how to finish that sentence. Consider what? Abandoning her plans to teach at the settlement and coming to live in his isolated cabin. That was absurd. She had a purpose, a calling, and he had no right to ask her to give that up. But Lily was smiling at him with such warmth that Preston felt his heart stutter. "Preston Nash," she said, "I believe you're trying to ask if I might have feelings for you too, and the answer is yes. I know it's fast and probably foolish, but I've never felt as safe or as seen as I do when I'm with you. So whatever you're trying to ask, the answer is yes." Preston couldn't help himself. He reached out and cupped her face with one calloused hand, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, when she instead leaned into his touch, he bent his head and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, like he was learning a language he'd forgotten. But when Lily's hand came up to rest against his chest, right over his pounding heart, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and hope and the possibility of healing. When they finally broke apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to let you go tomorrow," he confessed. "Then don't," Lily whispered. "Come to the settlement with us. Stay at least for a while, see what might be possible before you retreat back to your mountains." It went against every instinct Preston had developed over the past 5 years. But sitting there with Lily in his arms, feeling more at peace than he could remember being since before the war, he found himself nodding. "I'll stay," he agreed. "For a while." The settlement, when they finally reached it the next afternoon, was smaller than Preston had expected but clearly built by determined, hard-working people. There were perhaps 20 buildings in various stages of completion, from a few solid structures with proper roofs to others that were little more than frames. Fields had been marked out and partially cleared, though the rocky desert soil would be a challenge for farming. Preston could see why they wanted families willing to work hard and stick it out through the difficult early years. Thornton introduced Preston and the others to the settlement's unofficial leader, a man named Jacob Torres, who'd come west from Texas with a vision of building a community where people could make fresh starts. Torres was in his 40s, weathered by sun and work but with sharp, intelligent eyes that assessed Preston carefully. "You planning to stay, Mr. Nash?" Torres asked directly. "For a time," Preston said, unwilling to commit to more than that. "I've been helping guide the Thornton party, and I'd like to see them settled before I head back to my cabin." Torres nodded slowly, his eyes flicking between Preston and Lily in a way that suggested he saw more than Preston might have wanted to reveal. "We could use a man with your skills if you decided to stay longer. Someone who knows hunting and tracking, who can help with security and guide people through the territory. But I understand if solitude calls to you." Preston appreciated that Torres wasn't pushing, just laying out the option. It made him more inclined to consider it seriously, though the thought of staying in a settlement long-term still made his palms sweat. The settlement provided a vacant cabin for Lily to use until a proper schoolhouse and teacher's residence could be built. It was small but sturdy, with one main room, a sleeping loft, and a stone fireplace that would be essential come winter. Lily stood in the doorway looking at her new home, and Preston watched a mixture of emotions play across her face. Excitement, apprehension, determination. "It's perfect," she declared, turning to smile at Thornton and the others who'd helped bring her here. "Thank you all so much for letting me join your journey." Preston helped carry her few belongings into the cabin, his mind working through possibilities he'd never considered before. The settlement was about a day's hard ride from his mountain cabin, longer with a wagon, close enough that he could visit if Lily wanted him to, far enough that he could still retreat to his solitude when the memories got too heavy. Maybe there was a middle path he hadn't seen before, a way to have connection without giving up the peace the mountains provided. Over the next few days, as the Thorntons and Richardsons got settled and began integrating into the community, Preston found himself staying on. He helped with construction projects, using the strength in his arms and back to raise walls and frame roofs. He hunted, bringing back deer and rabbit that he shared with the community. And every evening, he found his way to Lily's cabin, where they would sit outside and talk as the desert cooled and the stars emerged. Lily began organizing the school, even though there were only 7 children in the settlement currently and no dedicated building yet. She held classes in the shade of a large cottonwood tree by the creek, and Preston sometimes found excuses to be nearby, just to hear her teaching voice, different from but just as beautiful as her singing. She was patient with the children, encouraging them and making learning feel like an adventure rather than a chore. "You're good at this," Preston told her one evening as they walked along the creek. "Those children adore you already." "I love teaching," Lily said simply. Seeing the moment when understanding lights up in a child's eyes, when they realize they can do something they didn't think they could. There's nothing else like it. Preston understood that feeling in his own way. He'd felt something similar when he'd first started learning to truly live in the mountains, becoming skilled at tracking and hunting and reading the weather in the clouds. There was satisfaction in mastery, in knowing you were good at something meaningful. "Lily," he said, stopping to face her. "I need to go back to my cabin soon. I've got furs I need to process before winter, repairs that can't wait, but I don't want to go without understanding what's happening between us." Lily looked up at him, her green eyes serious. "What do you want to be happening?" Preston took her hands in his, feeling how small and soft they were compared to his own scarred and calloused ones. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to come visit you here, and maybe you could come see my cabin too, see the life I've built. I want to see if what we feel is real and lasting, or if it was just the intensity of the journey that made it seem bigger than it is." "I already know it's real," Lily said with quiet confidence. "But I understand you need time to be sure. And I need time, too, to settle into my role here and see if this place will truly become home. So yes, Preston, court me. Visit when you can. And know that I'll be here, waiting and wondering and hoping." Preston kissed her then, under the cottonwood tree with the creek burbling nearby and the last light fading from the western sky. It was a kiss that promised patience and persistence, that acknowledged the challenges ahead while celebrating the connection they'd found. When they finally stepped apart, Preston felt that sense of peace again, the quieting of his restless spirit that only Lily seemed to bring. He left for his cabin 2 days later, but not before speaking with Jacob Torres about possibly taking on some informal work for the settlement, guiding newcomers through the territory and hunting to supplement their food supplies. Torres seemed pleased by the offer and didn't press Preston about making it more formal than he was comfortable with. The ride back to his cabin felt different than any Preston had made before. Usually, returning to his mountain sanctuary brought relief, a sense of coming home to the only place he truly belonged. This time, he felt like he was leaving something important behind, like home might no longer be solely in the mountains but partly in a small settlement with a woman whose voice could calm storms. His cabin looked exactly as he'd left it, the solid log walls and stone chimney standing strong against the pine-covered slopes. Inside, everything was in its place, his furs waiting to be processed, his tools hung neatly on their pegs, his simple furniture arranged for the efficiency of one person living alone. But for the first time, Preston looked at it and saw the emptiness rather than the peaceful solitude. He threw himself into work, processing his furs and making the repairs his cabin needed before winter arrived. The physical labor was familiar and satisfying, but his mind kept drifting to Lily. He wondered what she was doing, how her teaching was going, whether she thought about him as often as he thought about her. The wondering itself was strange. Preston had spent years training himself not to wonder about things he couldn't control, to focus only on the immediate and the practical. 2 weeks after leaving the settlement, Preston made the journey back with fresh meat he'd hunted, and some repairs he'd offered to help with on the schoolhouse that was now under construction. His heart was pounding as he rode into the settlement, searching for a glimpse of chestnut hair and green eyes. He found Lily with her students by the creek, though they'd built some simple benches now and erected a canvas cover to provide shade. She was teaching them a song, and the sound of children's voices mixing with hers made Preston smile. When she spotted him, her whole face lit up in a way that sent warmth flooding through his chest. Lily excused herself from her class and walked over to meet him, propriety preventing her from throwing herself into his arms the way Preston could see she wanted to. "You came back," she said, and he could hear the relief in her voice. "I said I would," Preston replied. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I hoped you would," Lily corrected. "But hoping and knowing are different things." Preston wanted to kiss her right there in front of the entire settlement, but instead he settled for taking her hand briefly, squeezing it in a way that promised more private moments later. "I'm here, and I've got 2 days before I need to head back. Maybe you could show me around, let me see what's changed while I was gone." Those 2 days fell into a pattern that repeated over the following months. Preston would spend several weeks at his cabin, hunting and trapping and processing furs, then ride down to the settlement for a few days. He always brought something useful: meat, furs for clothing, his skills for building or repairing. And he always spent as much time as possible with Lily. They courted in the way of frontier couples, with more honesty and less formality than might have been proper in the East. They talked about everything, learning each other's thoughts and dreams and fears. Lily told Preston about her worry that she wasn't good enough at teaching, that she'd fail the children who were counting on her. Preston shared more about the war, about the nightmares that still came though less frequently now, about the guilt he carried for surviving. "You survived for a reason," Lily told him one evening as they sat on the porch of her cabin, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Maybe that reason is sitting right here next to you. Maybe you survived so that one day you'd hear me singing to some frightened horses and decide to see what the commotion was about." "You really believe that?" Preston asked. "That things happen for reasons." "I believe that we can make meaning from even the hardest things," Lily said. "Your survival doesn't have to be about the war anymore, Preston. It can be about what you do with the life you've been given." As autumn deepened and the air grew colder, Preston found himself staying longer during each visit, reluctant to return to the mountains even as winter approached. The settlement had grown too, with 3 more families arriving and another dozen people, including several single men who looked at Lily with interest that made Preston's jaw clench. But Lily only had eyes for him, a fact that both thrilled and terrified him. "I need to head back to my cabin soon," Preston told her in late October as the first snow dusted the peaks. "Winter comes early in the mountains, and I need to be prepared. I probably won't be able to come back down until spring." He watched Lily's face fall, though she tried to hide it. "Of course," she said. "You have to do what's necessary to survive the winter, I understand." "Lily," Preston said, taking both her hands in his, "come with me." She looked up at him in surprise. "What?" "Come to my cabin for the winter," Preston said, the words rushing out now that he'd started. "Not to live there permanently, just to see it, to see if you could imagine spending time there. We could have weeks together without me having to leave. And then in spring, when the pass is clear, we can decide what comes next." "Preston, I can't just abandon my students for the entire winter," Lily said, though he could see the longing in her eyes. "They're counting on me." "What if I came back for you after the first snow?" Preston suggested, his mind working through the logistics. "Give you time to prepare your students, set them up with lessons they can work on during the winter. Then spend a few weeks with me in the mountains, see how you feel about it. If you hate it, I'll bring you back. If you don't." He left the implication hanging between them. If she didn't hate it, maybe it meant they had a real future together. Maybe it meant his cabin in the mountains didn't have to be a solitary refuge anymore, but could become a home shared with the woman he'd grown to love. Lily bit her lip, clearly torn between her responsibility and her heart. "Let me talk to Jacob Torres and some of the parents," she finally said. "If they're comfortable with the children taking a break from formal lessons for a few weeks, if we can set up something for them to work on while I'm gone, then yes, I'll come." Preston felt hope and fear war in his chest in equal measure. What if she came to the cabin and realized that his life was too harsh, too isolated for her? What if she couldn't stand the winter cold or the deep snow? What if being trapped in close quarters with him for weeks made her see all his flaws and rough edges and decide she'd made a mistake? But Lily was looking at him with such trust and warmth that Preston pushed down his fears. He'd survived worse things than having his heart broken. Though if he was honest, he wasn't entirely sure that was true. The settlement was supportive of Lily taking a winter break from teaching. The parents understood that frontier life required flexibility, and several of the mothers offered to work with the children on their letters and numbers using the materials Lily prepared. Jacob Torres gave his blessing as well, with a knowing smile that suggested he was glad to see 2 people finding happiness in this hard land. Preston returned 2 weeks later, after the first real snow had fallen, and made travel more difficult, but not yet impossible. He brought a sturdy horse for Lily to ride and furs to keep her warm on the journey. The trip to his cabin normally took him most of a day. With Lily it would take longer, but Preston didn't mind. Every moment with her was precious. They set out on a cold November morning, their breath fogging in the air as the horses picked their way through snow-covered trails. Preston kept a careful eye on Lily, watching for signs of cold or discomfort, but she seemed entranced by the landscape rather than bothered by the weather. "It's beautiful," she said as they climbed higher and the pine forest grew denser around them. "I've never seen country like this. It can be dangerous too," Preston warned, "especially in winter. That's why I need you to promise that if we get to the cabin and you decide it's too much, you'll tell me immediately. I'll bring you straight back to the settlement, no questions asked." "I promise," Lily said. "But Preston, I'm not as fragile as you seem to think. I may be a teacher, but I grew up on a farm. I know about hard work and harsh conditions." Preston nodded, accepting that she had a point. It was easy to forget that frontier women had to be strong in ways that society ladies back east never had to consider. Still, there was a difference between working a farm in Ohio and surviving a mountain winter in Utah territory. They reached the cabin late in the afternoon, as the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Preston watched Lily's face as she took in his home for the first time. The solid log structure nestled in a clearing, smoke already rising from the chimney where he'd left a fire banked that morning, the shed where he kept tools and stored meat, the small corral for the horses. "Oh, Preston," Lily breathed, "it's wonderful." He felt a burst of pride at her reaction, though he tried to keep it from showing too much. "It's not fancy," he said. "Just one room with a sleeping loft, but it's warm and solid, and I built most of it myself." Inside, the cabin was just as Preston had described, simple but well constructed. There was a large stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves holding supplies and books, and a ladder leading up to a loft where Preston's bed was visible. Furs covered the floor and hung on the walls for insulation. It smelled of wood smoke and pine, masculine and clean. Lily turned in a slow circle, taking it all in, and Preston felt his heart in his throat waiting for her verdict. Finally, she smiled at him. "I can see you here," she said. "I can see how this place has helped you heal, and I'm honored that you want to share it with me." The tension in Preston's shoulders eased. "I'll take the floor," he said, gesturing to the loft. "You should have the bed. I'll make it comfortable down here by the fire." Lily looked like she wanted to argue, but then nodded, accepting that propriety mattered even here in the wilderness. They were courting, not married, and Preston would do nothing to compromise her reputation or his honor, no matter how much he might want to hold her through the cold mountain nights. They fell into a routine over the following days that felt both strange and completely natural to Preston. He'd lived alone for so long that having someone else in the cabin should have felt intrusive, but instead it felt right. Lily sang while she cooked, her voice filling the space and making it feel more like a home than it ever had before. She helped with chores without being asked, learning quickly how things worked in this environment so different from what she was used to. Preston taught her to snowshoe, taking her on short trips through the winter forest to check his trap lines. Lily proved to be a quick learner, and she delighted in the landscape, finding beauty in the way snow clung to pine branches and icicles hung from rock faces. She sang to the animals they encountered, and Preston watched in amazement as a deer that should have bolted instead stood and listened until the song ended. "You really do have a gift," he told her as they made their way back to the cabin one afternoon, the low winter sun painting the snow orange and pink. "Music is a language everyone understands," Lily said. "Even animals. It speaks to something deeper than words." In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk for hours. Preston found himself sharing stories about his childhood he'd thought he'd forgotten, good memories from before the war changed everything. Lily talked about her dreams for the future, how she wanted to build not just a school but a real educational system in the settlement, maybe even start a lending library someday. "You could have both, you know," Lily said one night as they sat close together on the fur-covered floor, the fire crackling before them. The mountains and the settlement. You don't have to choose one or the other forever. What do you mean? Preston asked. I mean you could keep this cabin as a refuge, a place to come when you need the peace of solitude, Lily explained. But you could also have a life in the settlement. Help build the community, use your skills to guide and protect people. Have a family. You don't have to be alone anymore unless you choose to be. The word family hit Preston with unexpected force. He'd never let himself think that far ahead, never imagined he might have children of his own someday, a wife to grow old with. It had seemed like a future meant for other people, not for a broken soldier who couldn't even make it through the night without nightmares sometimes. But as he looked at Lily in the firelight, her green eyes reflecting the flames, Preston found himself imagining it. Children with Lily's gift for song, maybe, or his love of the wilderness. A bigger cabin or a house in the settlement where Lily could teach and he could serve as guide and hunter. The mountains still there when he needed them, but not as a hiding place anymore, just as a part of who he was. I love you, Preston said, the words coming out rough but sincere. I didn't mean to, didn't plan to, but I love you, Lily rose. And if you'll have me, I want to build that future with you. Mountains and settlement, teaching and guiding, all of it. Lily's face softened with joy. I love you too, Preston Nash. I loved you from the moment I saw you standing there watching me sing to those horses, looking like you'd found something you didn't know you'd lost. And yes, I'll have you. I'll marry you and build a life with you, wherever that life takes us. Preston kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, pouring all his feelings into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I don't have a ring to give you, he said. But I swear I'll get you one, a proper one, as soon as we can get to a town with a jeweler. I don't need a ring to know you mean it, Lily said. Your word is enough. They stayed at the cabin for 3 more weeks, and those weeks became some of the happiest of Preston's life. The nightmares that had plagued him for years came less frequently, and when they did, Lily was there to wake him gently, to sing softly until his breathing calmed and he could sleep again. Her presence didn't erase the trauma he'd experienced, but it gave him something to ground himself in, a reminder that there was more to life than the darkness of the past. In turn, Preston helped Lily discover a love of the wilderness she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to track animals through the snow, to read the weather in the clouds, to find edible plants even in winter. She was never going to be a mountain woman in the way Preston was a mountain man, but she could appreciate the beauty and peace of this environment in her own way. When they finally made the journey back to the settlement in early December, before the deep winter snows made travel impossible, it was with the understanding that this was temporary. They would spend the winter in the settlement, where Lily could resume teaching and Preston could help with winter work and planning for spring. But they were engaged now, committed to each other, and come spring they would be married. The settlement welcomed them back with genuine warmth. Jacob Torres shook Preston's hand and congratulated them both, saying the community would benefit from having a man of Preston's skills committed to staying. The parents were glad to have Lily back teaching their children, and the children themselves were thrilled, gathering around her with questions about the mountains and what she'd seen. Preston spent the winter working harder than he had in years, but with purpose beyond mere survival. He helped build the schoolhouse that would give Lily a proper place to teach. He guided hunting parties to supplement the settlement's winter food supplies. He shared his knowledge of the territory with men planning to explore further in the spring. And every evening, he would go to Lily's cabin, where they would sit by her fire and plan their future. They were married in April of 1879, as soon as the circuit preacher made his spring rounds through the territory. It was a simple ceremony held outside in the spring sunshine, with the entire settlement in attendance. Preston wore new clothes he'd purchased on a trip to St. George, though he'd refused to cut his hair beyond a basic trim, and Lily wore a dress of pale green that matched her eyes, sewn by some of the settlement women as a wedding gift. When the preacher asked if Preston would take Lily as his wife, to love and cherish all the days of his life, Preston's voice rang out strong and clear. "I will." And when Lily promised the same, her voice was the same one that had first drawn Preston to her, full of beauty and certainty. They spent their wedding night at Preston's cabin in the mountains, making the journey there together as husband and wife. Preston carried Lily over the threshold, both of them laughing, and then made love to her with a tenderness and passion that spoke of all the lonely years behind him and all the shared years ahead. Afterward, as they lay together in the loft with furs pulled over them against the mountain chill, Lily sang softly. It was a new song, one Preston had never heard before, and he realized she'd composed it for him. It spoke of wilderness and home, of restless spirits finding peace, of love that healed old wounds. "You calmed my restless spirit," Preston whispered against her hair. "That first day, hearing you sing to those frightened horses, something in me settled for the first time since the war ended." "And you gave me a home," Lily replied. "Not just a place, but a person to build a life with, someone who sees all of me and loves me anyway." They spent 2 weeks at the mountain cabin for their honeymoon, then returned to the settlement where they'd decided to make their primary home. Preston had added a room onto Lily's cabin while she'd been teaching that winter, turning it into a proper house for a married couple. But they kept the mountain cabin too, going there for a few weeks each summer and sometimes in the quieter parts of winter. A retreat where Preston could reconnect with the solitude that still fed his soul and Lily could find the peace that singing to the wilderness provided. Preston became an integral part of the settlement's growth. He guided new families through the territory, helped with construction and hunting, and served as an informal scout and security for the growing community. But he was never apart from Lily for more than a few days at a time, always returning to her and the home they were building together. Lily's school flourished, growing from 7 students to 15 and then to 20 as more families arrived. She became known throughout the region as an exceptional teacher, one who used music and storytelling to make learning come alive for children who might otherwise have found books and lessons tedious. She started the lending library she dreamed of, gathering donated books, and even ordering some from back east with money the settlement pooled together. Their first child, a son, was born in the spring of 1880. They named him Robert Nash, after Preston's younger brother who died at Shiloh, and Preston held the tiny baby with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the gift of this new life and the chance to honor his brother's memory in such a beautiful way. Lily sang to Robert from the moment he entered the world, and the baby seemed to know his mother's voice, calming instantly whenever she used it. As Robert grew, Preston would take him up to the mountain cabin, teaching him to love the wilderness the way Preston did. And Lily would sing to him, passing down her gift just as her mother had passed it down to her. The boy grew strong and curious, with his father's love of the outdoors and his mother's musical talent. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Grace, who seemed to be born with sunshine in her spirit. And 3 years after that, another son, Thomas, who was quieter than his siblings but whose thoughtfulness reminded Preston of himself as a child, before the war had changed everything. Preston's nightmares grew increasingly rare as the years passed, replaced by dreams of the life he was living rather than the horrors he'd survived. When they did come, Lily was always there, singing him back to peace, reminding him that he was safe and loved and home. The settlement grew into a small town with a proper school building, a church, a general store, and even a telegraph office connecting them to the wider world. Preston and Lily became respected elders in the community, though they were still young themselves, looked to for advice and leadership. But they never forgot where they'd come from or the journey that had brought them together. On summer evenings, when the desert cooled and the stars emerged brilliant overhead, the whole family would gather outside their home. Lily would sing, her voice as pure and beautiful as it had been that day she'd calmed the frightened horses. The children would join in, their young voices blending with hers, and Preston would sit with his arms around his family, his restless spirit finally and completely at peace. Sometimes visitors to the town would ask Preston about his life, curious about the mountain man who'd become such a pillar of the community. He would tell them about the war and the years of isolation that followed, about the night he'd heard a woman singing to frightened horses, and decided to see what the commotion was about the love that had healed him in ways he'd never thought possible. "I was lost," he would say, "living but not really alive. And then I heard her voice, and it was like she sang a path for me to follow home. Not to a place, but to myself, to the man I was supposed to be." And if Lily was there, she would add her own part to the story, about the frightened horses and the rough-looking stranger who'd appeared like something out of a legend, about learning that strength and gentleness could exist in the same person, about building a life that honored both her calling to teach and Preston's need for the wilderness. "We each had something the other needed," she would explain. "He needed peace and I needed strength, but together we found both." Their children grew and had children of their own, staying close to the town or venturing out to build their own lives elsewhere, but always coming back to visit the home where Preston and Lily had created something lasting out of a chance meeting on a desert trail. Preston lived to be 73 years old, his body finally wearing out after a life lived hard but full. His hair had gone silver, his face had weathered like the rocks he'd loved to climb, but his eyes remained sharp, and his love for Lily never dimmed. When the end came, it was peaceful in the mountain cabin where they'd spent their honeymoon, with his family around him and Lily's hand in his. She sang to him at the last, the same hymn she'd been singing that day to the frightened horses, and Preston's final breath came as the melody washed over him. His restless spirit, so long calmed by her presence, finally found its ultimate peace. Lily lived another 7 years, continuing to teach even in her old age because it was who she was at her core. She sang to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing down the gift that had changed not just her life but Preston's as well. And when her own time came, her family swore they could hear Preston's voice joining hers in her final song, welcoming her home to the place where restless spirits and calming voices met at last. The mountain cabin stood for generations, maintained by their descendants as a memorial to the love story that had begun with singing, and a restless heart finding peace. And on quiet evenings when the wind moved through the pines, people said you could still hear music carried on the breeze, a reminder that some bonds transcend even death, and that true love, once found, echoes through eternity. In the town that had grown from that small settlement, they erected a simple monument in the square. 2 names carved in stone, Preston Nash and Lily Rose Nash, with the inscription, "Her voice calmed the storm. His love gave her home." And beneath it, the years of their lives, 1850–1923 for Preston and 1854–1930 for Lily. Lives well lived and fully loved. The story of the mountain man and the singing woman became legend in that part of Utah, told and retold to each new generation as an example of how love can heal even the deepest wounds. How two people who seem to be living completely different lives can find in each other exactly what they need. It was a story about courage and vulnerability, about the willingness to risk the safety of isolation for the beauty of connection. Their grandchildren would tell their own children about Preston, about how strong he'd been, with arms that could split logs all day and hands gentle enough to hold a baby bird. They'd describe how he'd ride down from the mountains with meat and furs, but always made time to play with the children of the town, teaching them to track and ride and respect the wilderness. How he'd been fierce in protecting those he loved, but kind to anyone who needed help. And they'd speak of Lily with equal reverence, about the teacher who'd educated not just their parents but their grandparents, who'd instilled in generations of children a love of learning and music. How her voice could calm crying babies and frightened animals, how she'd sung at every wedding and every funeral, marking the passages of life with her gift. How she'd built the lending library that had given so many their first taste of literature and learning. But mostly they'd speak of the love between them, how Preston and Lily had been inseparable, how they'd worked together to build not just a family but a community, how they'd never stopped courting each other even after decades of marriage. How Preston would still bring Lily wildflowers from the mountains, and how Lily would still sing for Preston alone in the evenings, private concerts for an audience of one. The story of their meeting, with the frightened horses and the stranger drawn by a song, took on an almost mythical quality. Some versions claimed Preston had appeared out of nowhere, a guardian sent by Providence. Others said the lightning had struck so close that Lily's singing was the only thing that saved the whole wagon train from disaster. But the core remained the same: a restless man searching for peace, a woman with a gift for bringing calm, and a love that changed both their lives. Their letters, carefully preserved by the family, revealed the depth of their connection in their own words. Preston's letters from his trips to guide wagon trains or hunt in the mountains were simple and direct, but filled with longing. "I miss your voice. The mountains are quiet without you. I'll be home soon." Lily's replies were longer, filled with news of the children and the town, but always ending with some variation of, "We count the days until you return. The house feels empty without you." It was found in his pocket when he died, still legible despite the years, a testament to how deeply her words had touched him. Their legacy lived on not just in their descendants, but in the very fabric of the community they'd helped build. The school Lily had started grew into a full education system with multiple buildings and teachers. Preston's knowledge of the territory, shared freely with anyone who asked, had helped countless families find their way and thrive. The paths he'd scouted became roads. The hunting grounds he'd identified became sustainable sources of food for the growing population. But perhaps their greatest legacy was the example they'd set of what marriage could be: a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection, where both people brought their strengths and supported each other's weaknesses, where love deepened and grew richer with each passing year rather than fading into comfortable indifference or bitter resentment. Young couples in the town would sometimes seek out their advice in the later years, asking them the secret to a lasting marriage. Preston would usually defer to Lily, uncomfortable with being seen as any kind of authority on matters of the heart. But when pressed, he'd say something simple but profound: "Love her more than you love your own comfort. Choose her every day, not just once at the altar." And Lily would add, "Let him be who he is. Don't try to change him into something he's not." Preston needed the mountains, and I never tried to take that from him. He needed me, and he never let fear keep him from reaching for that. We made room for each other's needs. Their love story became a part of the town's identity, a source of pride and inspiration. When hard times came, as they inevitably did in frontier life, people would remember Preston and Lily. If two people who'd lost so much could find such joy together, if a lonely mountain man and a traveling teacher could build something lasting, then surely any challenge could be overcome with enough love and determination. The mountain cabin, preserved and maintained, became something of a pilgrimage site for their descendants. Newlyweds would sometimes spend their first night there, hoping to capture some of the magic that had blessed Preston and Lily's marriage. The family would gather there for reunions, multiple generations filling the clearing with tents and laughter, sharing stories of the couple who'd started it all. And on those nights, when the fire burned low and the youngest children had been put to bed, someone would always begin to sing. Usually it was one of Lily's daughters or granddaughters, having inherited her gift. The song would be one of the old ones, the hymns and ballads Lily had loved, and the family would join in, their voices rising together into the mountain night. In those moments, with music filling the air and family gathered close, it was easy to believe that Preston and Lily were there too, watching over the legacy they'd created, pleased with how their love had multiplied and spread through the years. The restless mountain man who'd found peace, the singing woman who'd found her home, together forever in the lives they'd touched and the love they'd shared. And so the story ended not with death but with continuation, with the understanding that true love never really ends but transforms, becoming something larger than the two people who began it. Preston Nash and Lily Rose Nash had found each other against all odds, had loved each other through every challenge, and had created something that would outlast them both. A family, a community, and a legacy of love that would echo through generations to come. The mountain man had found his peace. The singing woman had found her home, and together they had found everything that mattered. Their story was complete, their love story told, their lives fully lived and deeply cherished. In the end, that was all anyone could hope for. To love and be loved in return, to build something lasting, to leave the world better than you found it. Preston and Lily had done all that and more, and their memory lived on. A beacon of hope for anyone who'd ever felt lost or restless or alone. A reminder that somewhere out there, someone was waiting to sing you home,